Tonight, we have to ask ourselves, is this part of a much bigger, well-organized scheme to cause maximum chaos and a possible color revolution in America? Hello, America. 3 months before the 2020 election, I did a show where I asked, are we in a color revolution? I'm going to come back to this later in the show, but there are political operatives literally holding a secret war game on what to do if Donald Trump won the election. That was in 2020. The special showed you, laid it all out. It included everything from mass civil unrest on the streets to even secession. Both the mainstream media and social media network pundits and influencers alike were all moving in parallel to ensure Trump would lose. I've never seen anything like it. Well, not domestically, at least. And now, what do you know? Seemingly, 4 years, it's a protest cycle, currently back on track. Civil disobedience rocking college campuses, and it appears to have backing from network media, social media, labor unions, and NGOs. It's fascinating. It's almost as if these activists and political operatives have a 4-year hibernation cycle, and then they wake up every time there's an election. And we're only in May. So how bad will this all get the closer we get to November? Well, it depends on if I'm right or not on the theory I'll present to you tonight. How bad will it get if Donald Trump maintains a solid lead in the polls? I want to show you a few things. Check this out. Have you seen this? The Blaze recently ran a story on a new group called the Escalate Network. They want to, quote, bring the Intifada home. And they're looking to improve upon what was started with the anti-Israel encampments. You can go to their website and you'll find and download things like this. Do-it-yourself occupation guide. How to set up blockades. Anarchist tactics at Standing Rock. And the very lovely sounding How to Build the End of the World in Defense of the Chaotic Protester. Now, let's just imagine that up in Alaska, in the mountains, all by herself, there's a little old grandmother that is writing something like this. Her motivation is pro-life. Or maybe she was parading in the Capitol, and then she went back and she put these things out. The FBI would be raiding their homes right now. It would be wall-to-wall media coverage. I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure the Blaze was maybe the only outlet to even touch this story. Strange, isn't it? I am seeing the same color revolution signs that I was seeing back in 2020, and I believe we're this close to seeing here on what's happened in places like Eastern Europe and the Middle East. I talked about this on my show at Fox a lot. And I had all of the pieces except for the government and the media. Now, Time magazine reported a last-minute order came down from the top in 2020. Quote, the word went out, stand down. Well, that's because Biden won. But what happens this time? And who are the architects of this? Time magazine said they saved the republic, and they did it all in secret and denied it when I was talking about it. Color revolution officially became an accepted U.S. foreign policy strategy after the Cold War. The CIA, and we all know this, were manipulating elections and street movements all over the world. But the entire strategy changed in the late 1980s and early 90s. I want you to see this insane article from the Washington Post in 1991. The New World of Spyless Coups. This article, look it up, it goes on to describe that a new era in regime change had been born. NGOs, non-governmental offices, or organizations, labor unions, and media outlets could now topple governments in ways the CIA could only dream of. Color revolution had now been privatized. Listen carefully to some of the names and the organizations mentioned in this article in 1991. They're going to come up a lot in tonight's show. The story mentions the CIA no longer has to spend time developing media assets from the article that they now, quote, they just call CNN. It also mentions the U.S. NGO, the National Endowment for Democracy, whom the Washington Post calls the sugar daddy of overt operations. A lot of people have questioned some of the shady crap that the NED has done in foreign countries over the years, but the average person here in America hasn't even noticed. But if there is any question, listen to this quote from the NED's founder, quote, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA." Wait a minute. The National Endowment, the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, who funds that? Congress. So let me ask you, how happy are you that your dollars that you work hard for are funding private NGOs that are waging color revolutions in countries you're not even talking about? Is that what America stands for? The article goes on to list some of the other people and organizations that are involved. They include labor unions like the AFL-CIO, and even back in 1991, George Soros. Color me shocked on that one. All right, so let me explain a color revolution. This color revolution for dummies, I think it's actually color revolution for people who don't want a revolution, because they all understand this. You start with the government, okay? This article, there's usually governments involved, CIA, State Department, USAID, all of these people, we know what's happening, and ultimately the office of the president. Then the operation is privatized to distance the government. They privatize, go to NGOs, fund, encourage, help, turn the other way. The National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the American Center for International Labor Solidarity, Center for International Private Enterprise, all of that. So the first two supposedly advocate for either the left or right agendas, giving the entire NGO a bipartisan designation. The last two cover labor unions and private corporations. So we have that. Now we need lots more money. We need private money. We need billionaire financiers and organizations that will partner in the entire operation. This is where people like George Soros and his Open Society come in, or the Tides Foundation. If you've watched me for all these years, you know all of this already. Perhaps you forgot because we were talking about it in the Middle East and what could happen here if they weren't stopped. Lastly, the last train here is action. There needs to be people that spread the message, that demonstrate in the streets and report the news to the masses. This is the blueprint for privatizing regime change. It's how public opinion is manipulated, mass media is harnessed, and youth organizations and movements are weaponized. This is the birth of the color revolution. When we come back, I'm going to show you how this was used to manipulate governments all over the world recently. The same names, the same people, the same organizations pop up every single time. What's worse is the lessons we learned from the Cold War were unleashed in the early and mid 2000s, and those lessons, where do they lead? Where do those characters turn their sights next? Us. Is it possible they began operating here at home? Would they just stand by and let Donald Trump win again? Maybe. I'll explain. We've got a lot to cover. Next. So I'm a dog owner. If you're a dog owner, you know it can be a lot of work, but it is, there is nothing like a dog's love when you come home and see your dog. My buddy. If you're feeding your dog kibble food, you may not know that kibble food is not really good for them. It doesn't have all the nutrients and everything, the probiotics that your dog needs. Just like us, if you ate stuff that had been cooked at high temperatures and then the flavor sprayed on, which if the left gets their way, maybe that's what we'll be eating. But you need something to put all of the nutrients and the probiotics and the antioxidants back in to your dog's food, and this is where Rough Green comes in. It's not a dog food, but a supplement that you sprinkle on the dog's food. It was created by naturopathic Dr. Dennis Black, and it is full of vitamins, minerals, probiotics, antioxidants, you name it. If it's healthy for your dog, it's probably in Rough Greens. You get your first bag free just to try out. All I want you to do is go to roughgreens.com/Beck or call 833-GLEN-33, 833-GLEN-33, roughgreens.com/Beck. Tonight's show is a very important show, and I ask, even if you've never watched me before or you think you know who I am and you hate my guts, please just listen to the information and do your own homework. I'm not asking you to believe me, but this is a very important time in the Republic's history. All right, so let's go back to the early 2000s. America made color revolutions, and they were sprouting up all over the world. This is an article from The Guardian. It identifies the United States as the main actor behind the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. They all have a different, color. It also just casually identifies other color revolutions that we were involved in Latin America, Serbia, Georgia, and Belarus. Tens of millions of your taxpayer dollars were involved. Now take a look at who the paper identified as the main actors. Ready? The National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the U.S. State Department, USAID, George Soros Open Society Institute. The entire operation, which would later be dubbed as Color Revolutions, involved clever and mass-produced marketing, computer activists, youth movements that were willing to hit the streets. The Guardian described it as, quote, the operation engineering democracy, not a republic, democracy, through the ballot box and civil disobedience is now so slick that the methods have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. Okay, we've been fighting Russia over in Ukraine at least since 2004. The entire world used to acknowledge that we were behind it. Interesting context now that we're at the brink of possible nuclear war in World War III. Meanwhile, while the world burned, the color revolution experts leveled up. They learned from the governments they toppled and perfected the process. If you watch my Ukraine specials, this is going to sound very familiar. In 2009, Hillary Clinton, as Obama's Secretary of State, launched a new initiative at the Department of State called Civil Society 2.0. We warned you at the time. In short, this program was a public announcement for everything that had been going on over the past decade of attempted regime changes all over the world. What it was an announcement that the State Department would now seek out foreign resistance movements. Grassroots organizations, and train them on how to harness the internet and social media. In other words, this is how you topple your government through Facebook, Twitter, and messaging apps. Oh, and by the way, it's a conspiracy theory that any of those apps or organizations were coordinated through the State Department or through the White House. Well, guess what happened? Just a year later, it was the Arab Spring. You and I watched it together. Youth movements hit the streets all over Northern Africa and the Middle East. And they were organized with lightning speed, utilizing social media and phone apps. In fact, the White House at the time called people like Zuckerberg and said, "Don't shut this down." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? You'll never guess who was found to be some of the biggest trainers and funders of the Arab Spring activists. Here they are: the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, also known as the congressionally funded National Endowment for Democracy. When the advocates and activists hit the streets, their governments fall. It's the same names every single time this happens. In 2015, thousands of activists hit the streets of Macedonia, utilizing the same tactics seen from color revolutions in Europe and the Middle East. And in an amazing stroke of coincidence, Judicial Watch found that the U.S. State Department and USAID had been giving millions to the Macedonian arm of George Soros's Open Society Foundation. What for? To train youth movements. Again, same people every single time. Nothing is as it seems, ever. And this explains so much if you just do your own homework and you allow yourself to see. I'm going to show you later in the show, right here in our own country, nothing is as it seems. Let me give you another example. Have you seen what's currently happening in Hungary? Massive wave of protests have broken out all over alleged claims of government corruption. Now, it's surprising because Orban usually has a very strong approval rating. Huge. This headline caught my eye. Online influencers lead thousands demanding change in Hungary. Well, now, okay, that could be a coincidence, but it sounds familiar. I just wonder if any of the usual American suspects are involved here. Well, let's look. Oh my gosh. The National Democratic Institute, NED. They began polling Hungarian youth back in 2018. Then they did it again in 2020. Okay, well, that lines up. But then there's this. A Hungarian NGO recently accused another Hungarian NGO, an online media outlet, of being under foreign influence. The accused organization is described as a watchdog NGO and online newspaper for investigative journalism, and they specialize in being critical of the government. Now, I don't see a problem with that. I mean, that's what media is supposed to do. But what's with the accusation of foreign influence? Well, we looked into their financial information, which, to their credit, is fully transparent and listed on their website. But transparent or not, if any of the usual suspects are listed here, let's say it just might look a little fishy. So let's see here. In 2019, they got funding from, George Soros's Open Society initiative. Okay, maybe that's a fluke. In 2020, they got funding from George Soros. Okay, well, I mean, maybe he just really loves Hungary and freedom. In 2021, they got funding from George Soros and his Open Society Institute. Well, I mean, is there a year that George Soros didn't fund this NGO? Yes. According to the financial report for 2022, and the Soros cash cow, it finally dried up. But guess who stepped up into his place? The National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, when it comes to civil unrest and color revolution, it is truly the same names, time after time after time. And we know they hate people like Hungary's Viktor Orban. He doesn't play the open borders game. He talks about Hungarian culture. He puts Hungary first. He doesn't give in to the radical LGBTQ lobby. If there's someone they dislike more than Trump and Putin, it might be Viktor Orban. Now, do I agree with his policies? I don't know. I'm not Hungarian, okay? His government is not a constitutional republic with a Bill of Rights like ours, so I wouldn't elect him president of America. I don't want that system. I kind of like the one we have here. where we are all created equal. But does this mean that our country needs to meddle in Hungarian politics? And who the hell are these people that are doing it? I don't want George Soros running the world. I don't want the State Department. I don't even know who the State Department really is. Should we be bankrolling these projects all over the world? On this chalkboard, bring up the... oh, no, it's actually this chalkboard. Let me show you this. On this chalkboard, I outlined the entire color revolution process. I showed you the names of the organizations that have been involved for decades. They learned a lot. But we know their playbook. And I'm curious, are there any signs of this playbook showing up here in America? Oh, yeah. We begin there when we come back. Okay, God forbid I am right, but I have told my family that I think I am, and we have to be prepared. And you have to be prepared. These color revolutions happen. They happen fast, they're violent, and then they're over, and surprise, you have a new country. But in that time of chaos, do you have what you need? You have the medicines you need just to exist, your heart medication. In my family, 2 of my daughters take anti-seizure medications. Do you have antibiotics? I want you to consider calling Jace Medical, Jace Case. This is a personalized emergency kit that contains 5 essential antibiotics that treat the most common and deadly bacterial infections. Jace is continually working to expand their medication offerings. They even have added ivermectin as an option in the Jace case. Plus, you can buy a gift card for your family or loved ones so they can have the medicine they need on their own and personalized to their needs. You should be empowered. You are the one that should be empowered to care for yourself and your family. Don't trust anything, please. Trust yourself, do the right thing. I would like you to check out jacemedical.com. That's jacemedical.com. Enter the promo code Beck at checkout for a discount on your order. JASE medical.com. I was at Fox during the Arab Spring, and I wouldn't call them predictions, more of just following the trails, looking and just using common sense. But when I did that, the media destroyed me. Tides Foundation, Soros spent millions of dollars to discredit me. The first prediction, if you will, was that everything that was happening in the Middle East would return to a caliphate. If you watched me back then, you probably saw the reaction, oh my gosh, Glenn Beck is crazy. Everybody said it. But then they all kind of shut up quickly when ISIS declared a caliphate that spanned multiple countries and continents. The other thing I said was that the Arab Spring would escalate and cascade from the Middle East across Europe and then eventually to the United States, and that Islamists would work alongside Marxists, leftists, communists, and anarchists. And they would all move in parallel, not coordinating, just now is the time, bending the governments to their will and destroying the Western governments and Western way of life. If nobody would bend, regime change would be the ultimate goal. In short, a color revolution. The same foreign policy tool that the United States, we know, documented, well-documented proof from stories that people who don't agree with me agree with and say that's true. Look it up, New York Times. The United States has been training youth movements all over the world for years. Now, let's take a look at what's happening here in America today. Last month, pro-Palestinian mobs invaded college campuses all over the country. And I'm seeing some familiar names and organizations and their money beginning to pop up. A source showed Patrick Webb that the New Students for a Democratic Society, otherwise known as SDS, has been helping plan the college encampments as far back as November. SDS, 1960s. They were the new left. We talked about them ad nauseum at Fox. They also occupied Columbia University buildings in 1968. They were part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. They've seized buildings. They took hostages in the 60s. The Weather Underground splintered off from SDS, and that birthed a new era of left-wing political violence. One of those guys was Bill Ayers, a name that you've heard me talk about many times before. He was one of the most notorious. This is a photo of Ayers addressing the pro-Gaza encampment at the University of Chicago just a few weeks ago. This is the place that made threats to America and corporations and everything else. And it's an odd combination. What does the radical leftist that was free love and peace and freedom, what do they have to do with a pro-Palestinian or Hamas movement? Why would they be in the same bed as Islamists? Let's go to Students for Justice in Palestine. They have been identified as some of the organizers in a few of the campus encampments. The founder of SJP has been accused of having ties to Hamas. In fact, there is a current lawsuit that alleges Students for Justice in Palestine are collaborators with Hamas. So there's no doubt that Hamas is an Islamic terror group. The U.S. government even recognizes that. So Bill Ayers, SDS, what are you doing there? Oh, but these aren't the only odd bedfellows marching for Gaza. Antifa, their websites are now reporting on the encampments as if they were correspondents. Antifa? And not to be outdone by the Islamists and the anarchists, revolutionary communists are doing the same thing. Oh, and I would be derelict if I also didn't mention, and this is true, fatties for a free Palestine. Okay. I'll have all of those links up at glennbeck.com so you can do your own homework, including this really good breakdown from Tablet magazine that goes through all of the strange bedfellows that make up this wave of color revolutionaries. Check out the headline. People Setting America on Fire, an investigation into the witch's brew of billionaires, Islamists, and leftists. Kind of sounds familiar, almost like the Arab Spring would cascade into the United States and the Islamists and leftists and the communists and anarchists will work together. Gosh, I wish somebody would have predicted that and warned us over a decade ago. Where would we be today? Now, I'm not betting 1,000 here. I did miss Fatties for Palestine, and I'm kind of sad they didn't call me. Hey, Fatso, you want in? I wouldn't have been, but I mean, at least you could have called. My mistake. Color revolutions go nowhere without a good supply of cash and the usual suspects, and they're popping up all over the college campuses. Want to take a guess who funds many of these groups? Come on, you'll never guess. George Soros and the Tides Foundation. You're not shocked, neither am I. And what a coincidence that in 2020, another election year, Soros and the Tides Foundation were bailing out rioters during the Summer of Rage. Where else will the money trail lead us? How many more of the usual suspects will we find? Well, maybe it's just me, but I thought it was interesting when we found that the National Endowment for Democracy has been funding youth initiatives in the Gaza Strip to, quote, strengthen democratic values and understanding among the youth leaders in the Gaza Strip. The organization will lead a training series for a cohort of intellectually driven young men and women. Then they will mentor them as they identify, develop, and conduct community initiatives reflective of this training. Oh, so like tech camps for the youth in Gaza, a place where Hamas, a terror group, has a 90% approval rating. Are we in a color revolution? we're now seeing pro-Palestinian encampments popping up in places outside of colleges and universities. And they're being greenlit by labor unions. Interesting. Labor unions, Soros, the Tides money, the NED, youth movements composed of leftists, anarchists, and Islamists. It all looks very familiar. But when we come back, a little bit further in the rabbit hole we go. I want to talk to you about getting out of pain. I used to live with horrible pain every day, and if you do it or have done it, you know, it just sucks. Thankfully, I found out about Relief Factor. They were advertising on this program for a few years before I even tried them, and I didn't try them because I went to the Mayo Clinic and I talked to some of the best doctors. I mean, this is a natural supplement. That's not going to work. My wife changed my mind. She actually said she wouldn't listen to me whine anymore if I didn't try it. So I thought I'd try it for 3 weeks. That's what they recommend. And they said, if you don't see any difference within 3 weeks, it's probably not going to work for you. Well, I was stubborn. I took it for 3 weeks and I thought, I'm just feeling better. And I stopped taking it. And when I stopped taking it, it got worse. So I started taking it again. And then I apologized to my wife. The 3-week quick start is only $19.95. It's a trial pack. It's not a drug developed by doctors. Hundreds of thousands of people have ordered Relief Factor, over 1 million now. 70% of them go on to order more month after month. I'm one of them. ReliefFactor.com, 800-4-RELIEF, 800, the number 4-RELIEF, ReliefFactor.com. So the question I started with tonight is, are we currently in a domestic, homegrown color revolution? Well, I want to go back to this first chalkboard because it frames out how our own government facilitated regime change all over the world. There's a government, ultimately at the top. Support is given through organizations like USAID, the State Department, or somewhere else within the administration. Then you have a degree of separation. It's privatized. NGOs, the National Endowment for Democracy, National Democratic Institute, International Republican, all of these things. Then there's the money, the people with the real money, and that's people like George Soros through his Open Society, and Tides. We should do a show again on Tides, or just look it up on YouTube. You'll find an old show of mine on Tides. And even government-funded NGOs like NED, again, over here. The money this time is coming from you. Excuse me. Finally, the demonstrators, the youth movements, the people who hit the streets, and a sympathetic media that will help deliver their message. I'm going to add labor unions in here because they are contributing to the organizing of these protests. It's grassroots. Okay, so this is how revolutions are set up. But what are the conditions for one to be successfully conducted? When can regime change actually be attempted? Well, State Department learned this by doing it over and over and over again. And we know it because Obama's ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, literally wrote the book on it. This is what was required, as per Obama's administration, to topple a country. Are you ready? You need a semi-automatic regime, not fully autocratic. It has to be semi. You have to have an unpopular incumbent. You have to have a united and organized opposition. Do we have these things yet? Then you have to have the ability to quickly drive home the point that the voting results were falsified. You need the media to inform people about the falsified vote. You need an opposition capable of mobilizing thousands of demonstrators. And then you need divisions among the regimes, coercive forces like the military or the police. Sounds like we have all of those, doesn't it? See, this is why all of this always moves in concert with a national election. Have you ever noticed the last, 8, 12 years, every major protest movement we have seems to kind of magically have this 4-year hibernation cycle. What a coincidence. I don't want to believe this about my country, but I believe it is true, and I believe it is coming. I believe we all need to pray for our republic and be very aware. I first saw signs that we were in a color revolution back in 2020, a group called Fight Back Table. It teamed up with a few other organizations to form something called the Transition Integrity Project. Well, we looked into it. It didn't seem like they were really doing a peaceful transition thing. They produced this document, which was the findings of the election night war game that analyzed what would happen if Donald Trump were to beat Biden. This thing is nuts. Again, it's at gb.com, glennbeck.com. Make sure you look at it, read it, please. It involved everything from unleashing waves of demonstrators on American streets to actually using the threat of secession to force concessions from Donald Trump. One source told the Daily Beast Fight Back Table's mission and what it was all about: occupy stuff, hold space, and shut things down, not just on election day, but for weeks. Now, maybe it's just me, but that kind of sounds like a color revolution. Well, that was then. So where did they all go? Well, the head of Fight Back Table was a woman named Deidre Schiffling. Want to take a guess what job she took next? She now works at the White House. She's one of the organizers that formed Fight Back Table. She's at the White House. The other one is now at a leftist think tank called Demos. Wait a minute. Didn't we talk about this before? We've seen them. Oh, I remember. It was in an expose recently that came out on how the Biden administration was working directly with them to influence the next election. So the radicals that were wargaming 2020 went directly to work with the White House and in the White House. Now, can you turn the lights back up for the chalkboards here? I mean, looking at our chalkboard of the players involved in conducting a revolution, well, we're 1 for 1. So let's scoot over to the other chalkboard now for a second. We're not a fully autocratic regime, and that's not what you need. You need a semi-autocratic regime. They believe Trump is Hitler, and they've told half the country believes that he is Hitler. They've got a fully united opposition. They're prepared to drive home, the point that the election was illegitimate. Hillary Clinton has been saying that just about every week since 2016. Listen to the media. They're already planting the seeds again. But what about number 5? Enough independent media that will be on their side. Well, we already know the media. I mean, it sucks. It's never been more biased, but lately it has gotten so insane that even their own employees are saying something weird, especially government employees. A 25-year veteran of NPR recently accused the outlet of injecting bias into their reporting and crushing dissent within the company. And he specifically called out their CEO, Catherine Maher. Well, before NPR, where was she? Well, she was the CEO of the Wikimedia Foundation. Now, I'm not accusing her of anything here, but if her goal was to influence public opinion and inject bias, leading both Wikipedia and NPR are pretty good spots to be at, right? But this gets a little more interesting. Chris Rufo has just pointed out in his investigation that Maher has, shall we say, an interesting work history. Before NPR, she was employed at the U.S. State Department. And before that, the National Democratic Institute. As I showed you earlier, NDI is one of the main branches of the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. And when she was there, again, you'll never guess, When she was there, what happened? The Arab Spring. And remember what the Ned and the U.S. government strategy did during the Arab Spring. What was their strategy? Their strategy was training youth movements on how to influence public opinion through mass media and ultimately to organize in the streets. Oh, and then topple the regime. Chris Rufo found tweets from one of Maher's contacts in northern Africa where he all but calls her a CIA agent. And he made that claim in 2016. He also pointed out how Wikimedia was changing, and not in a good way. If you look at the history here, it is really hard to miss. He also found some of Maher's now deleted blog posts, where she talked about how seizing control of radio could be a way to govern a country. She said, quote, "Control over the flow of information in a closed society can be tantamount to control over the state." That's coming at you from the former head of Wikipedia and the current head of National Public Radio. Now, it might be nothing, right? But the sudden narrative switch from Wikipedia, did you read the story on it today? How they changed all of the stuff when they went after, I think it was Alito that had the flag, and they just changed it overnight. All of a sudden, all the history of the Appeal to Heaven flag changed overnight. And then NPR and the NED connection during a time when color revolutions were kicking off all over the world. I mean, it's peculiar at the very least. As I said a minute ago, I don't want to believe any of this stuff. But is there any other connection to the National Endowment for Democracy and anything else happening here in the United States? Well, if you just asked that question, I'm glad you did. We found out a few months ago that the NED, with cash directly from the State Department, was funding a group that was trying to censor Americans for disinformation. The Blaze was actually one of the sites that showed up on their blacklist. One of the main topics they were trying to censor was alleged voter fraud during the 2020 presidential election. They didn't want the right to be saying that. It has to be new and fresh. I mean, who needs to know if, the elections are fair, right? We did some more digging into NED financing that went to groups operating inside the United States. We found a grant from 2017 for over $75,000 to the Tides Foundation. Now, it says for supporting civil society engagement in Latin America, and it may be, but the entire reason you give to the Tides Foundation is to make the money go dark. You say it's for one thing, and then you're like, yeah, but I don't really want to. And that's what they do. Now, I have a feeling Ned knows this. It's just a hunch. Back to the chalkboard. We've got government involvement at the top. We've got signs of private NGOs like the National Endowment for Democracy. We have financiers, Soros, Tides, also through the government, through Ned. We're 3 for 3 here. But what about organizing demonstrations and the ability to pop up on the streets at a moment's notice? Well, we already talked about how the encampments are now branching out away from college campuses. Labor unions have been helping. SEIU issued a statement to universities to support the protesters. It all but sounded like a direct threat. And 2 months ago, SEIU announced its, quote, largest investment ever. They committed $200 million to, quote, mobilize working class voters to back President Biden and other Democrats. And the final piece on the chalkboard, 4 for 4, media. Oh, that's weird. Our country has been involved in revolutions and change of governments in foreign countries. They call them color revolutions. We've been doing it for decades. Is it truly out of the realm of speculation that they might turn that experience inward if our government had enough revolutionaries that didn't like our system? I'm reminded of a quote from Michael Schellenberger in his investigation on how the government teamed up with private military and intelligence contractors to censor Americans. One of the contractors expressed, quote, her own apparent surprise that she had ever used such tactics that were developed for foreign nationals against American citizens. Franklin said, we've given you a republic if you can keep it, but a republic that does not inform itself of the truth, if it doesn't ask the hard questions, and the hardest questions are the one you ask yourself, about your own country. Together we've learned a lot about our country, and I still believe in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but I don't think a lot of people are living that in and out of Washington, D.C. And I believe we are ripe for a color revolution. This next election could be insane. And all the signs indicate that the other side, it tends to reach deep into their bag of dirty tricks. We know the playbook. We know what to look for. The obvious thing here is to ask me, okay, so what do we do about it? I don't know. I always told you that I was just somebody that was to point out the exits and how far we were to the next gas station. Take this exit now, 23 miles before you can get off again. And finally, there would be a bridges out sign. We have to vote. We need to know what to look for. We need to vote them out. We need to drain the swamp. But we need to be honest. We need to be level-headed and not contribute to the chaos they want you and them to experience. We have to live the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, even when it hurts our own side. The law is the law. And then I'll give you this piece of hope. These rights don't belong to us. They belong to the Almighty Creator of heaven and earth. I will say something I don't think I've ever said on the air before. I believe Christ is coming in my lifetime. Could be wrong. But we know how this works. We know who wins. Please pray for the Republic. From Dallas, good night, America.